Today I'm going to show you how to make a fidget quilt suitable for people who like to fidget, neurodiverse, dementia, etc. I've cut out backing squares that have fusible fleece on the back at 14 centimetres squared or 5.5 inches. I've got 9 squares in total and I've added a seam allowance of about a centimetre. Apologies, I swap between centimetres and inches. So my first square is going to have these lovely tactile tassels on, and I've made some homemade bias binding out of one of the fabrics I've used for the backing squares. However, you can use any bias binding you like. So as you can see, I've got the raw edge folded underneath, and I am basting this down with a tacking stitch before I run it through a sewing machine. So the way this fidget blanket works is that we're creating each square individually with the different textures, fiddle elements, etc. And then we'll sew it all together. So this is a nice and easy square to start with. The next one, I've got strips of ribbon that I'm going to hand stitch down each on opposite sides to hold in place whilst I then machine stitch them in place. And then on the opposite, not on the opposite, on the alternative sides, I'm going to have some white ribbon that's going to weave in and out between these. It will make sense as you see it come along. I'm making sure any basting tacking stitches I do are in the seam allowance, so they won't show at the end when it's all complete. So now that's stitched at either side, I'm going to get my white ribbon and I'm double folding over the edge there and hand stitching that down. I did try using a glue stick, but it didn't work. So much for a quick and cheap method. There's quite a bit of hand stitching in this project, to be fair. So once I've turned in those raw edges, I am attaching a button to the end. And then once I've got these 4 ribbons prepared, we're going to add them to the side, ready for weaving through. So you're going to do this with 4 ribbons, and then you're going to hand stitch them down on one side, because these are for the person to weave in and out as they so wish when they use the fidget quilt. So I won't show you each individual one because you'll get bored. But you can see how it works here. Right up, my next square, I have crocheted some fluffy yarn. Now you could use anything here, you don't have to crochet at all, but it's a very fluffy tactile fabric which I am hand stitching down in the seam allowance on opposite sides, so the person using the fidget blanket can press and place their hand underneath between the 2 layers, between the fluffy crocheted fabric and the cotton backing. And then I've machine stitched that in place too. Next up is a scrunchie, a ribbon that I'm going to attach the scrunchie with the ribbon to the square. And then I've got these little circular white things, I don't know what they're called to be honest, that I'm also going to add to this square to add a bit of interest, and I'm going to hand stitch those in place. They did come in a kit with little mirrors, but I've omitted the mirrors. Next up is a square with a zipper closure, so I've got 2 pieces of contrasting fabric where I've pressed in the raw edges, and I've sewn the zipper in between with a zipper foot, and I've shortened the zipper just by tacking on the edges, and I'm going to machine stitch that in place, adding a hoop of ribbon and a curtain ring. The next square is some cording from making jewellery and some beads, and I'm going to thread these on. Had to play around with finding some beads that had a big enough easy hole to thread. I did want a reasonably strong thread to run across the square, so there was no chance of it breaking. So I'm just threading a variety of beads on, not counting them, just going by instinct. Now I did consider knotting the ends, but instead I realised that I can hand stitch through that cord and then secure it into the seam allowance, so that's what I'm doing. And I'm going to do 3 across that square, then that square's done. Now the next square is buttons. So again, I've used some of a different piece of fabric which I'm going to put interfacing on. I found the buttonholes didn't work without interfacing, and I've applied buttonholes, and then I'm going to sew the buttons on. So that's another square done. Now the next one, I've got a different type of fabric again, and I'm interfacing it because it's very floppy. And I'm going to fold it in half to create a triangle, and I'm going to add a magnetic closure so that this fabric magnetically closes to the base square. So that's a different type of closure for people to fiddle with. Now inserting a magnetic closure, I'm just adding another bit of interfacing just to make that stronger. And then I'm going to use a seam ripper to create the 2 little holes for the magnetic closure. So I'm going to insert that from the right side through those little holes I've made, and add another bit of interfacing just to make that fully secure. Now I've folded it back over and I've added it to the square, and I'm going to work out where the other half of the magnetic closure goes. Apologies for the head. So I'm going to mark that and cut with the seam ripper and insert the other half of the magnetic closure. I did consider having something to put in and out of this pocket, but in the end decided against. But you can make this your own and add any details you want. I just, having looked at the tutorials online, realised that not many of them went into the how-tos for the individual squares, which is why I've made this one. So that's now secure. Place that on, and then I'm just going to pin or tack around the seam, in the seam allowance again, to hold that all nicely together. So once you've finished your squares, you're going to join them all together in the seam allowances, stitching along the edge of your fusible fleece. Apologies, I don't have a video for that bit. So now we're on to layering up the quilt top. So I've got a base fabric, just cotton fabric, wadding that I just had in my stash, quilting wadding, nothing in particular fancy, and I am pinning this in place, and I am going to stitch in the ditch between each square. So just trimming down my excess here, the starting point. So I'm going to stitch that onto the machine. And now we are going to prepare some bias binding. So I'm cutting strips of fabric 2.5 inches wide and folding it in half and giving it a press. Now I've chosen this fabric out of my stash because one side was quite satiny, and I felt that would be quite a nice, just reminded me of one of my brothers actually in their baby blanket, and how it got cut down, and all they had left was satin ribbon. You're going to place the raw edge of your folded binding on the back of the quilt so the edges align, and you're going to stitch 1/4 inch from the edge. And I'm just showing you how to do the corner here. So you fold it upwards to get the triangle, then downwards, and then you get a really nice point. And we're going to you start and stop 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt. And here we are now joining the pieces together. So I folded in the raw edge, stitched along, and then I'm closing that down, and I'll stitch along there. So I'm basically encasing one raw edge inside one folded edge. Turn it over and then turn over your binding and pin. So you're now working on the right hand side of the quilt. When you get to the corners, you're going to fold one edge right to the edge, and then that will create you a nice triangle as you fold the other edge down, and just pin that in place. Now you're going to stitch along the edge of your binding all the way around your quilt. So here you have it, one finished fidget quilt, blanket, whatever you wish to call it, with a variety of textures and fastenings to play with to your heart's content. Weaving, scrunchies, texture beads, tassels, huge variety. Now I have to admit, I made this just because I fancied it and I'm really pleased with it. I'm really pleased with the different fabrics and how they work. Hope you've enjoyed watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiration.